First off, I just want to thank everyone for being here. This is super cool. I've done this for a few years online because of COVID, and so this is my first time doing it in person. And I'm so glad to see all of you wonderful people here. And I also just want to give you like a brief breakdown of like what to expect. I'll talk for, I don't know, about 30 minutes or so. And I'll put some pretty pictures up here too. And then afterwards, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions and we can discuss and hopefully have some really interesting back and forth. So without further ado, again, thank you. A little girl picks petals from a daisy before an ominous countdown begins, culminating in a nuclear apocalypse. These are the stakes, Lyndon Johnson warned in the iconic 1964 Daisy ad. To make a world in which all God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must love each other, or we must die. Perhaps no single text or image captures the relationship between utopia and dystopia better than the Johnson campaign's Daisy ad, as a byproduct of a clear choice between two stark alternatives, two potential futures in sharp relief. While the ad has long been denounced as the beginning of a dirty sort of politics, the truth is that then, as now, public policy really is a matter of life and death, of choices between private gain and public good. Johnson's opponent, Barry Goldwater, famously celebrated his ability to manufacture mass death in defense of global capitalism abroad and white supremacy at home. Those really were the stakes. A Goldwater administration promised nothing less. Today, we stand on the outskirts of a very real dystopia, one built by generations of public policy. But as we might imagine in the idyllic opening of the Daisy ad, I would like to suggest that we are likewise on the cusp of a utopian revolt. The vestiges of imperialism, from the resurgent global authoritarian movement targeting racialized and marginalized groups, to the devastated ecology wrought by global capitalism, present a vast and deteriorating wasteland in our midst. Ours is a world of diminishing opportunities for the many to sustain the few. A common sense dystopia populated by preppers, bunkers, and escape capsules to nowhere. As Black radicals and revolutionaries have long argued, white supremacy itself, the very cornerstone of the state in the US, represents a functional dystopianism, a pragmatic and profiteering embrace of mass death and human suffering. If we are to survive, we must instead embrace ways of living founded on de-escalation, on restitution, and on public welfare. We must, in short, create a utopian revolt. While some may object that the premise of a utopian society is unrealistic, the dystopian nature of the present, and indeed of white supremacy itself, makes it a survivalist imperative. Why would we accept dystopias, futures of unmitigated human suffering, as realistic, while dismissing the requirements for human survival as mere fantasy? Such an approach is not only defeatist, but nonsensical. If we can accept the transformation of reality into a macabre horror of human torment and deprivation, we must likewise concede that it is possible to transform our world into the transcendent, the egalitarian, and the sublime. In fact, utopian and futurist thinking isn't anything new in the US, and Black radicals have long been at the forefront of these movements for a better world. From the egalitarianism of abolition democracy, which sought to upend systems of property and power, through the experiments in communal living, in mutual aid and militant nonviolence, civil rights activists have long worked to transform a world constrained by the dystopian forces of racial capitalism into one based on human flourishing. In our remaining time together, I will examine two moments of utopian revolt in the Black radical tradition, situated against the functional dystopias of slavery and Jim Crow. The Black radicals of the 19th century and 20th centuries show the potential of a militant and unapologetic utopianism, as well as the urgency of understanding the dystopian systems under which we live. As we confront what may well be the last gasps of life in a habitable atmosphere, the utopian imperative is greater than ever. There is no future, no alternate potential existence other than a utopian one. When renowned black abolitionist Frederick Douglass spoke to an abolitionist convention in New York, he argued that, quote, nations should provide for all wants, mental, moral, and religious, and against all evils to which they are liable as nations. This was no mere egalitarian fantasy, but an urgent material project. Power, he famously told listeners, concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Here, Douglass had a particular group in mind to encourage, white abolitionists who, quote, profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation. Their unwillingness to take even the smallest risks on behalf of enslaved black Americans made slavery, Douglass argued in his 1857 speech, more powerful and entrenched than at any moment in American history. Although today we tend to think of the abolition of chattel slavery as inevitable, nothing could have been further from the truth. Whether from the perspective of enslavers who held the presidency and had effectively captured the Senate and Supreme Court, or from that of enslaved people who worked from dawn till dusk on plantations, docks, and the factory floor, overturning slavery would have seemed an impossible task. Slavery formed the cornerstone of global capitalism in 1860, with slave-produced raw materials like sugar, cotton, tobacco, and rice, facilitating industrialization and the factory jobs that went along with it. Even the most advanced, developed, and free economies relied heavily on goods produced by enslaved people. In Douglass's day, slavery was an institution wedded to civilization itself. A logic of total transformation defined the demands not only of black abolitionists and intellectuals, but black agricultural workers too. Formerly enslaved people themselves were at the forefront of movements to redistribute land, expand voting rights, and to create public resources to benefit all, regardless of race. From Louisiana to South Carolina, Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia, working-class black organizers and visionaries petitioned officials and pooled resources in a bold attempt to create a truly egalitarian democracy. While these movements failed to transform society, sabotaged by white elites at every turn, black thinkers saw them as nothing less than a survivalist imperative in the wake of emancipation. As formerly enslaved black South Carolinians from Modesto Island demanded of President Johnson, how could a legitimate emancipation process bind them once more to their former enslavers? While we've been trained to dismiss these demands for redistributions of land, wealth, education, and power as fanciful, they offer a realistic appraisal of the material consequences of slavery and the limits of social mobility imposed by those in power. As the Modesto Islanders explained in their petition to President Johnson for the return of their land grants, quote, "And we who have been abused and oppressed for many long years, not to be allowed the privilege of purchasing land, but to be subject to the will of these large landowners? God forbid. Land monopoly is injurious to the advancement of the course of freedom, and if government does not make some provision by which freedmen can obtain a homestead, we have not bettered our condition." Having served as property themselves, these black revolutionaries on Modesto Island understood on a personal level the ways that systems of property and power were designed explicitly at their expense, one that could only be addressed by radically upending existing networks of oppression. These demands for property and power coincided with a growing black revolutionary movement across the old enslaving South. During the war, enslaved people rejected the demands of overseers and enslavers, abandoning plantation spaces by the 100,000. Nearly 250,000 joined the US military to help defeat the enslaver regime of the Confederacy, hoping in the process to create a new world that would destroy once and for all the systems of torment and deprivation that defined racial capitalism. For formerly enslaved workers like Lucius Green, this meant organizing to overthrow the renewed plantation regime after it became clear that former enslavers had no intention of paying wages. Greene took matters into his own hands in rural Louisiana and, quote, drove the overseer out of the field, remarking at the time that it did not belong to him, and they, the freedmen, had the first claim to it and could do as they pleased. When the planter and overseer returned after the harvest, being away the whole time to take the crop, quote, Lucius refused and forcibly hauled off 60 barrels of corn and 12 bushels of potatoes. These utopian revolutionaries of the Emancipation era tied the destruction of the old regime to the creation of a new world, ripe with egalitarian potential. For famed Black abolitionist and educator Charlotte Forten, this meant traveling to the coastal islands of South Carolina to create schools for formerly enslaved South Carolinians. Among the first lessons she taught was, quote, about Toussaint Louverture, thinking it well that they should know one of their own color had done for his race. For Forten, her own work illustrated that Black revolutionaries and visionaries themselves showed the utopian potential of emancipation, one that might no longer be bound by the limits imposed by white supremacy. It was, she explained, a sight not soon to be forgotten, that crowd of eager, happy Black faces from which the shadow of slavery had forever passed. While we talk today with the knowledge that chattel slavery ended and universal suffrage prevailed, at least in theory, this was hardly inevitable from the vantage point of Douglass or Forten. And in fact, Black liberation had seemed so tenuous to Forten that she slept with a loaded pistol next to her bed, ready to defend herself quite literally from the ravages of white supremacy. Her example and her embrace of Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionary general and statesman, reveal the fragile nature of Black liberation and the urgency of a robust utopianism, one that embraced redistributions of property and power as the cornerstones of a better world. Black Americans understood clearly how racial capitalism worked and positioned themselves as the foremost theorists of their era. Their work in the 1860s and 1870s in collectivism, in education, self-determination, and self-defense remains among the most advanced in American history. If their utopian vision of a livable world remains incomplete, hijacked and sabotaged and suppressed by those in power, it also offers a model for transforming society, for seizing a livable future. Those lessons, embraced by the activists of the civil rights era, helped drag the US towards democracy and equality, overturning Jim Crow and ushering in the possibility of an equitable and livable future. Rosa Parks opened her 1985 interview for the Eyes on the Prize documentary series with an analysis of the dystopian landscape that she and other organizers confronted under Jim Crow. Everything was segregated by law, she explained. Transportation, occupation, and it was just one of those Southern traditions that was enforced in the schools. Looming at the back of this grotesque landscape of racial oppression for Black Americans was the very real possibility of spectacle violence, public attacks by city employees like bus drivers and police, alongside vigilante violence from bankers, grocery store clerks, and random passersby, all designed to instill racial terror and subordination and to promote white power. The famed Montgomery bus boycott, Parks remembered, drew support from the visceral and inescapable nature of this racist violence personified in the lynching of Emmett Till. As Parks put it, she and other organizers were, quote, devastated by the fact that in the United States of America, a child could be just taken out and killed without any consequence. Yet the bus boycott drew inspiration not only from the dystopian, impossible world of racial oppression in the US, but also from a utopian praxis that brought together a world of human potential and thriving. Parks had in fact been a longtime organizer. She met activists, attended workshops, including one organized by the Highlander Folk School, an explicitly utopian and egalitarian community with whom she would later share her reflection that Montgomery was, quote, a different place altogether since we demonstrated. For Parks and her fellow visionaries, equality meant putting ideas into practice regardless of whether or not they were accepted by the white establishment, an approach crucial to the success of the boycott. Although we don't usually think of her as a radical or utopian thinker, alongside famed revolutionaries like Stokely Carmichael, who later changed his name to Kwame Ture, or Fannie Lou Hamer, Parks's work suggests that we should, and illustrates two important features of civil rights era organizing. First, organizers built upon previous gains, organizations, and coalitions, creating a dynamic scholars now refer to as the long civil rights movement. We see this clearly, for example, in the way that Bobby Seale recalled adopting the Black radical mantle in the wake of the assassination of Malcolm X, in his opening lines from his 1970 memoir, Seize the Time. And in Seale's telling, in fact, the 10-point program of the Black Panther Party simply articulated, quote, what Black people have been voicing all along for over 100 years. On a macro scale, the work of civil rights organizing in the 1950s and 60s was made possible by the anti-lynching and advocacy of the Congress of Racial Equality and the NAACP, as well as a massive grassroots movement. Second, Black radicals grounded their revolutionary work in a careful assessment of the failures of the state to meet the basic needs of marginalized and exploited communities. For example, white lawmakers had designed the government to impede human survival for their own benefit at the expense of everyone else. Carmichael and Charles Hamilton argued, in fact, that Black people in this country form a colony, and it is not in the interest of the colonial power to liberate them. Thus, Black radicals of the civil rights era set out to both meet the needs of Black communities and, in so doing, to undermine the racial state as illegitimate. This was precisely the aim of the Black Panther Party's mutual aid programs, which it once fed, clothed, housed, and healed Black Americans while pressuring the state to actually meet the needs of Black communities. In a system designed to prevent it, the Panthers reasoned, survival was an explicitly revolutionary act. As Deputy Chairman Fred Hampton explained, first you have free breakfasts, then you have free medical care, then you have free bus rides, and soon you have freedom. While the Panthers' free breakfast programs were raided and destroyed by the FBI, which also orchestrated Hampton's assassination, they impacted thousands of families per week across the country and demonstrated the utopian potential of radical organizing. This was precisely the concern of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who wrote the agent in charge of the Bureau's San Francisco office that one of our primary aims in counterintelligence as it concerns the Black Panther Party is to keep this group isolated. In their Breakfast for Children program, they are actively soliciting and receiving support from uninformed whites and moderate Blacks. The Panthers' inability to disrupt systems of deprivation, in Hoover's telling, warranted their total annihilation. Hoover's approach to the Panthers put words to the often unspoken rules governing the functional dystopia that is American democracy. The FBI director had no qualms about destroying the meager resources, community building efforts, and countless lives in defense of existing systems of property and power. Yet he was right about one thing. The platform of the BPP was truly transformative. The Panthers framed the 10-point program to reorient society around human flourishing. Summarized beautifully in point 10, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. As they argued in point 1, we believe that Black people will not be free until we are able to determine our own destiny, which might only be accomplished by totally upending the racist systems of profit and power that Hoover fought so desperately to defend. Yet, as so often happened in our country's history, those in power turned opportunity into tragedy. Although we tend not to think about the Black Panther Party as supporting goals similar to the mainstream civil rights movement, often associated with Dr. Martin Luther King. In the months leading up to his assassination in 1968, Dr. King traveled the country stumping for a remarkably similar vision of society. The Poor People's Campaign he helped organize and mobilize until he was murdered sought to guarantee economic security as the foundation for political and civil equality. The program sought to secure a living wage, a guaranteed basic income, and access to land and capital as prerequisites for liberation, for equality. No mere faceless government program, the Economic Bill of Rights envisioned a, quote, recognition by law of the right of the people affected by government programs to play a truly significant role in determining how they are designed and carried out. King and his fellow organizers of the campaign, like the 10-point program of the BPP, put self-determination at the foreground of the future they hoped to create. And you can see the full Economic Bill of Rights that they proposed here, just after King's assassination. In his Other America speech, which King would make repeatedly during the last year of his life, he distinguished between the, quote, struggle for decency of the early civil rights integrationist organizing and, quote, struggling now for genuine equality in transformed and equitable systems of employment, of housing, of education. Even the premise of the Other America, that there are two, in fact, parallel Americas, grew from an engagement with the anti-colonial framework of the Panthers. King envisioned a relationship in which the poverty and powerlessness of the working poor, and especially of Black America, facilitated the wealth, stability, happiness, and power of middle and upper class white America. The transformations necessary to bridge the two Americas of his analysis would require a response that overwhelmed and undercut existing systems. It is much easier, he observed, to integrate a public park than it is to make genuine, quality, integrated education a reality, something we're still struggling to do in this country. In later versions of his speech, King emphasized the militancy required to bring this utopian America into being. I've been searching for a long time, he told listeners just weeks before his assassination, for an alternative to riots on the one hand and timid supplication for justice on the other. And I think that alternative is found in militant, massive nonviolence. His conclusion bore a striking resemblance to Douglas's observation more than a century earlier that power concedes nothing without a demand. In King's telling, the early successes of civil rights organizers had been brought about by boycotts, by sit-ins and marches that undermined the ability of the segregationist state to police racial boundaries. What remained was the ability of white elites to retain control of wealth and power, as well as the opportunities that came along with them. This, too, in King's telling, would have to be broken. King outlined a vision for how an egalitarian, militant mass movement might transcend the two Americas in his last major work, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? He argued that the organizing success of the early 1960s illustrated that equality, quote, will not be legislated for us and delivered in neat government packages. Laws only declare rights, King explained. They do not deliver them. The oppressed must take hold of laws and transform them into effective mandates. Equality could only be reached, King argued, through the total and direct and immediate abolition of poverty as the foundation of racial capitalism and the systems of white supremacy associated with it. Through a guaranteed basic income and federal jobs guarantee, a militant mass movement could both address the legacies of inequality and sabotage its reproduction. The two Americas really could become one. Black visionaries of the 1960s had seen the timid lip service that the state was willing to embrace and understood that this was yet another tactic of an intergenerational regime of racial oppression and plunder. They were acutely aware of the ways that those in power used process and politics to sustain racial capitalism, even as they claimed to oppose it. White elites commissioned studies like the Kerner Commission, which concluded that, quote, white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. They ignored those findings. And yet, from the survival programs of the Black Panther Party to the Freedom Farm work of Fannie Lou Hamer, Black radicals worked to implement precisely this vision, one designed to sever the relationship between property and power. Although their projects were hampered by limited resources and active state sabotage, the utopian praxis of these Black visionaries points the way towards a livable society, one that prioritizes survival and happiness over property and power. Which brings us back to the present. We can seek solutions to the problems of mass misery and death, or we can succumb to them. Perhaps that's the power illustrated by the Daisy ad. Not of a dirty sort of politics, but an unseemly refusal to deny the threats we face. If the dystopian and the grotesque illustrate the pressing need for a robust utopianism, it also shows that if the fantastically horrific and odious are possible, so too are their opposites. It's a message Black radicals emphasized since the era of abolition. Another world is possible. And indeed, their utopian praxis brought new worlds into being, ending the very real dystopias made flesh in chattel slavery in the apartheid state of Jim Crow. Although white elites muted and sabotaged their utopian vision to the greatest extent possible, equality and liberation remain not only the brightest way forward, but potentially the only means of human survival. Thank you. Questions? Reflections? Statements of egalitarianism? Yeah, Luke.
So when thinking of a more utopian future, what do you think is the best praxis involved in that without being completely shut down by repressive state apparatus like the FBI, for example?
That's such a good question, and I think it combines both the visions of Dr. King and also the Panthers. The Panthers were much more heavily invested in mutual aid than Dr. King, but Dr. King was much more invested in mass mobilization. If you sort of combine these two, there's a security in that, right? And so my sense, from sort of sifting through their ideas and the history related to them, is that perhaps there is that greatest potential there in combining mutual aid with some sort of mass movement. It's a really good question. Thank you. Yeah.
So I think one stream that is implicit in a lot of what you're saying, especially when you're talking about the, so you talked a lot about the living wage and economic bill of rights and things. So the trade union movement in the United States really became modern during the Depression in the 1930s and grew during the 1940s. And the McCarthyism and the anti-communism and everything was very much a reaction to the progressive militant direction that the trade union movement had taken.
Yeah.
So even in Alabama in the 1950s, a big part of their ability to mobilize was that there was already a very strong working class movement to organize labor, and again, it was diverse. It was a multiracial movement.
Right.
The trade union movement, the CIO was very progressive at that time.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the things that's happened since a lot of what you're talking about is that basically there was a counter-revolution in the United States that started with started with Nixon kind of, and
That's
then
right.
really solidified itself with Reagan.
Yep.
And Reagan was a counter-revolutionary who sought to have the government overturn every single thing that was going on here.
Yeah.
Get rid of government, no government programs, welfare queens, blacks are taking away white people's stuff. All of this stuff is that the government is doing is going to undeserving people. That was like their whole program.
Yep.
And that counter-revolution is still actually, we haven't come out of that yet. We haven't been able to really break it completely yet and turn the tide in the other direction. And the union movement like completely suffered.
Yeah.
Like one of Reagan's main lines of attack was to destroy the trade union movement and the ability of workers to organize into unions. That's starting to turn around very slowly.
Yeah.
But people like Chris Smalls, who's leading the Amazon warehouse union.
Right.
I mean, Chris Smalls is a kick-ass revolutionary. I don't know if you've read anything that he's saying.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, I think that one of the things that we need to do is like start to learn how to tie these things together better.
Sure. Yeah.
And recognize that, you know, the Amazon warehouse union and the Starbucks workers union, they're fighting, you know, the same battle, like from a different side. And I think that, you know, I like the way, I really appreciate how you cast all of this as utopian, because it really is. It's like, we are fighting for a better world, you know? The Paris Commune in 1870 created the song, the Internationale. Right? A better world's in birth. Justice thunders condemnation. Yeah. A better world's in birth. You know, like, it's great. I really like that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was a really great point. And I think I may be getting the stat wrong, but I think in the last year we've seen more strikes, you know, over the last year than we have, if I remember right, it's in the last 50. It's something huge like that, right? I mean, so there is a growing labor movement that's tied to these other justice movements, right? Because really, you know, in our real lives, you know, our work and our ability to sustain ourselves, they're all intermingled, right? Along with our right to live and survive as who we are, right? All of these come together, you know, to form our experiences. And these movements, I think, are increasingly doing a very good job of tying all of these issues together. It's a really great point. Other questions or thoughts? Yeah.
So no, I was thinking, maybe very related to what you're saying is, so when you talk about these utopian visions, there are certainly people today who are doing it, right? When you talk about free society, when you talk about this.
Absolutely.
So how do you think that this needs to then, is the existence of several of these in several cities sufficient and it grows like that, or do they need to have a bigger vision and actually work together and in order to move things forward?
Yeah, that second one. Yeah, no, I mean, that's such a good question, right? Because like both geographically and culturally, right? Like we live in little silos often, right? And that does prevent us from working together to get the things that we sort of all really want and need, right? And so there is that need, I think, for these movements to be successful, for us to do a better job of working together. I'm reminded also of Frederick Douglass's scolding of his white abolitionist audience in 1847. You know, it was in fact the white moderates, King's white moderates as well, you know, who were sort of willing to pay lip service, right, to what needed to be done, but in fact not to take any sort of material risks, right? And so, you know, I guess I am a white American, right? And so, I mean, as myself, right, I see that as an important step towards justice, towards equality, towards this livable future as well. Well, I know there are pastries out there, so I don't want to like hold everyone hostage, but
I'll just ask you a question.
Sure.
Then. So where does the trajectory that you're advocating and hoping to see, how do we, like, where does the current infatuation with zombies and the Marvel multiverse fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't want to use like a, the hegemony word, right? But there is like, it's designed, I think, in some ways, perhaps, both to reflect our fears, but maybe also to get us to accept things that we shouldn't, right? These sorts of stories about zombies and the end of the world and things like that, they can also be to sort of scare some sense into us. Like all of these things can be true, right? But I do see, a major problem in many of us sort of accepting this zombie apocalypse or whatever, right, as inevitable, right? And that is something I think that we see in the realm of culture. We see that in the realm of movies and TV shows, right? I could probably name a dozen just off the top of my head from the last 5 years, right, that take a sort of a dystopian approach to the future. And, while that can be useful in mobilizing people, that can also lead us to give in to despair, right? And the politics of despair, are dangerous, I guess. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
So I noticed that in every revolution that we have, every movement that we make, there's always a pushback from opposing media sources and things like that.
Right.
Especially today, with like the protests, I believe like 2 years ago.
That's right.
I just want to know how you think we should approach the situation with the media and how we should combat that.
Yeah, that's another really daunting task, right? That's a great question. Thank you. And I think maybe the answer is, in part that we ignore it a little bit, but also that we create our own ways of communicating and our own networks of organizing. Like the Black Panther Party founded a newspaper, right? It gave a very specific, view of the world towards very specific goals, and we don't need to reproduce that exactly, right? But like we don't need the New York Times to say like, hey, the world's ending, let's get it together, right? We can do that ourselves, right? And I think that maybe is the better way forward, because all of those, media companies are companies, right? They're concerned with generating profit, and they're owned, right, by very wealthy people, right? And so there is a limit to the stories that they're willing to tell. And so I think that's something we have to keep in mind as well. Let's all go do a TikTok, right? Yeah. Cool. Well, if we're all good, let's go have some pastries, huh?
Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.